So now that we have a sense of why people hold money, and we know how the Federal Reserve controls the money supply, let's take a look at the demand and supply for money. A reminder that in this case, we are using one of those graphs where we've got demand and supply. So the money quantity, which is a stock, is over here. And the interest rate, which is I'm going to treat as the price of money because it is essentially the opportunity cost of holding money, is over there. It's a little different than the demand and supply curves for apples because what I've got down here is a stock, and what I'm looking at over here is sort of opportunity costs, and interest rates operate a little differently. But, you know, I'm going to follow the convention of putting the prices up there and the quantities down here. And I'm going to say that the demand curve for money slopes down. A reminder that this is not like the demand for apples. The reasons for a downward sloping demand curve have to do less with, oh, it's cheaper, because there is no such thing as cheaper or more cheap or less cheap when it comes to holding money compared to the interest rate. The demand for money increases as the interest rate falls, because as the interest rate falls, the return on stocks and bonds is going down. And just remember that it's not as attractive to hold stocks and bonds, and that's why people are holding money, right? So this is really more about the opportunity cost of how you hold assets, and not about, oh, it's cheaper for me to have more apples. It's not like that at all. Right? Because I'm not making any arguments about your total wealth and how you divide it, that your total wealth is going up or down. I'm just saying that you're changing the allocations of your wealth portfolio between stocks and bonds and money. So you've got transactions, precautionary, speculative, those kinds of demands for money. And then you've got the supply of money, and conventionally we're going to say that the supply of money is given because it's controlled by the Fed. So what is the supply of money? We're going to argue the supply of money is whatever the Fed decides it is. There are questions about this. So for example, some of you might have heard modern monetary theory that asks questions about to what extent does the Fed actually control the supply of money, in the sense that to what extent does the Fed actually manage to prevent banks from expanding or contracting the money supply through their checking account activities. All right? So there is a whole set of questions about that. There's a whole set of debates about that. But at this intro level, and if you're interested, we can discuss it in money and banking. But at the intro level, let's just say, using open market operations, reserve requirements, discount rates, the Fed sets the money supply. So what happens is that because this is the demand for money, when the Fed sets the money supply, the Fed essentially is also setting the equilibrium rate of interest. If the Fed wants the equilibrium rate of interest to decline, all it has to do is to expand the money supply using expansionary monetary policy, which would be to reduce the required reserve ratio, to purchase treasury bills, reduce the discount rate, anything that can create excess reserves in the system. And then that should expand the money supply because banks will start lending out the excess reserves and so on. But in a situation since 2008 where the banks were not actually using their excess reserves to lend out, to make more lending because they had so much debt overhang and bad loans and so on. Since 2008, as I had pointed out, the Fed actually does something different. It now actually offers an interest on reserves that banks hold with the Fed. What happens is that when the Fed starts offering an interest on reserves, banks look at that interest and say, oh, it's better for me to actually hold reserves with the Fed, right? And they move some of their assets by selling treasury bills into reserves and so on and so forth. And that in turn, when they sell treasury bills, will cause the price of stocks and bonds to drop, which is the same thing as raising the interest rate. So what the Fed is doing is it's actually impacting how banks are operating in the stock and bond markets, in treasury bills, by pushing the price of treasury bills up and down indirectly through the rate which it offers banks for their reserves. So this sort of indirect mechanism has a slightly different path than control of the money supply. It in fact has a different mechanism because it's essentially operating by having the banks act more like consumers, moving into and out of stock and bond markets. So with that in mind, so that gives you a sense of when and how does the Fed make decisions to operate in this or that way. But the basic idea is the interest rate is set by the Fed because the Fed uses policy to either control the money supply or to affect the behavior of banks in terms of whether they hold money or whether they hold stocks and bonds, and therefore change price in stock and bond markets, which in turn will affect the interest rate. So with this chain of differences, what we begin to realize is that we can have the government indirectly affect interest rates. And when the government can affect interest rates, connected back, it can in turn, assuming firms are responsive, not just in stock and bond markets, but in borrowing and lending, to create new production of capital goods and services, investment in that macro sense, it can affect the circular flow. So the indirect channel does depend on responsiveness of the banking system, making sure that stock and bond markets don't get so panicked or anxious that you get speculative bubbles. And finally, that the interest rate changes in turn generate the kinds of changes in firm behavior that can generate new sort of investment in new final goods and services and thus generate growth. So if that chain works out, then indeed that's a great virtuous circle. But if any point on that chain doesn't work out, then there is a case to be made for fiscal policy, because fiscal policy does have its effects more directly, and there are far fewer pieces that have to all align for fiscal policy to work. So usually most governments spend some time thinking about the situation, deciding which one to use. And by the time we finish this quarter, you're going to see that we actually have a lot of coordination between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve. You see a lot of interaction between fiscal and monetary policy, and it only works well or works best when both the central bankers and the budgetary officials are working in alignment. If that doesn't happen, you can sometimes have things going in opposite directions, the government trying to do expansionary policy, the Federal Reserve trying to keep the interest rate high. It doesn't really work well. Right? So we're going to come back and look at what happens now when we expand this system to include prices. Thank you.